Friends, how are you? Today from Ireland, we have Pat Reynolds with us. Pat, how are you?
Hi Christina, thanks very much for having me. I'm doing well, thanks.
Great, so that we can get to know you, where you got that accent, could you introduce yourself a little?
Well, as you said, my name's Pat Reynolds. I'm from Glasgow in Scotland, and I've been living in Ireland for 20 years now. But yeah, the accent's from Scotland.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Did you grow up in a Catholic family?
Yes, I came from an Irish Catholic family. All my family were Irish immigrants that moved during the difficult times in Ireland and settled in Scotland. So we had a very Irish upbringing. We went to Mass every Sunday, we went to Catholic school, we made all the sacraments. But to be honest, I didn't really understand my faith growing up. I went to confession, I went to my first communion, but the only thing I really remember about those days was, how much money I made, or, the party afterwards. So all these celebrations didn't make a lot of sense. I went to Mass and I really didn't understand what was happening. I remember as a child asking my mum, when the priest lifted up the host and I heard the bell ringing, I said, what does that mean? What's the bell for? And she said, that means you have to be quiet. And I remember thinking, really? That's all there is? So although we went through all the motions, I didn't really have an understanding that came with my faith. I always believed there was a God, but I didn't really understand what he wanted with me, or that he could love me personally.
Okay, let's go on to your adolescence, a difficult time. Did you fall away from God?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because although we practiced our faith through my early childhood, we had a lot of issues at home. I suppose one of the biggest to mention was that my dad was an alcoholic. So growing up, there was a lot of issues at home, a lot of tension between my parents. And both of them claimed to be good Catholics, but we saw a lot of arguments. I remember as a child thinking, if God really loved us, why would there be so much trouble at home? So as I became a teenager, my parents actually split up. And it gave me a kind of warped image of marriage. It gave me a warped image of God, of love. And I really tried to find somewhere to fit in. So a lot of things changed for me in a very short space of time. We moved home, we changed school. I went from primary school into secondary school, and my family split up in a very short space of time. And I really felt this sense of not belonging anywhere. So I went looking for somewhere to belong. And I found a group of friends who accepted me, but they became my new God in many ways. I lived for the weekend, I lived for my friends' affirmation. I tried to dress in a way that would be acceptable. I tried to listen to the music they listened to. So my whole life became consumed, and it was very controlled by peer pressure. And at the same time, my mum used to go to a prayer meeting every week. And from a young age, we used to go, and I would love it, and I would feel this real sense of the Holy Spirit. But again, God was very much up there, separate from me. I could see him moving in other people's lives. I even saw miracles happening. But that wasn't enough for me to understand that I was loved. And no one had really explained it in a way that I could understand. So when it came to a Friday evening, I had an option to go to the prayer group or to have friends. And as a teenager, I was like, oh, well, by God, there's my friends. And it wasn't so much that I chose to leave God. It was like I didn't have the opportunity to have both. I wish I'd had friends who had faith, because it may have kept me in my faith, but I didn't. And there didn't seem to be anyone else around who really tried to practice. So my weekends became about parties, drinking, girls. It became about all the things that the world offered. But deep down inside, I kind of knew that it wasn't fulfilling me, but I really didn't know anything else. So throughout my teenage years, that carried on, and more, I stopped really paying attention at school. My whole life became consumed by peer pressure. And I got very caught up in trying to impress people. So every day, I felt like I had to put on a different mask. When I went to school, I'd be the class clown. And when I went out of school, I had to be the party animal. And when I went to meet my girlfriend, I had to be Mr. Cool. Then I would go home to my mum and I'd pretend that I was a good boy who didn't do anything wrong. I always felt that I had to put on a different persona to be accepted. And after a while, I kind of began to forget who I really was. I didn't know myself. And even more, I really didn't know what God wanted from me or who He had made me to be. And even when there was little moments of grace, I didn't really know how to receive it. Yet my mum, throughout it all, she continued to pray for me. She continued to encourage me to pray and to go to Mass and to go to confession.
And while living this life, were you still receiving the sacraments? Did you go to confession?
I think confession for me, I had never really fully understood it. I mean, from a young age, I went in and I was taught how to make it when I think I was 7 or 8 years old. And I went in and I said the same 3 sins every time, you know, told lies, I was cheeky to mum, and, you know, I hit my sister, you know, which was in my head, something I was really guilty about. But I confessed the same thing every time. And right up into my teenage years, although I was taken to confession, I was never really honest. Although I always had a sense of like God's presence, even although I wasn't being honest. But after, I think when I was about 15 or 16, I kind of thought, if you're not going to be honest, what's the point? So I made the decision to stop going because I didn't want to be a hypocrite.
After your teen years, you went to the university, and what happened there?
Well, interestingly, when I finished school, I didn't do as well as I should have because I was living for my friends. My education was secondary, and in many ways that had become my new family because my family was so fragmented. I lived for these people. And I look back now and I'm not in contact with many of them, but at the time it was my entire life. But they all went off to university, to college, or they got apprenticeships, got jobs. And I still didn't know who I was. And I began to think, what am I good at? And the only things I enjoyed doing was like acting, singing, performing, you know, karaoke at the pub. And I thought, what can I do with these skills? And I thought, I'm quite good at pretending. I do it every day. I pretend at school, I pretend at home, I pretend when I meet the parish priest, you know, I'm a good boy, I come to Mass sometimes. But I thought, I could be an actor. If I'm an actor, then I can make money, I'll be famous, everyone will love me, you know, I'll have all the fame and fortune. And I thought, this is the goal. So I went to college to study acting and performing. I'd done my diploma and did my teaching diploma. And when I left, I got a job as an actor because there was an end of year, it was like a competition where we could showcase what we did. And I got 3 agents that wanted to come and give me jobs. So I picked the most well-known agent and I started getting lots of jobs in Glasgow, in Edinburgh. And many of my peers didn't get work after that. It fizzled out or we worked occasionally together. But I started doing really well. For the first time I was making money. People were recognizing me in the streets. I started working alongside, you know, celebrities. But as I began to meet these people, I began to realize that the message I was getting through the media and who they were in real life were 2 completely different things. For instance, one guy that I was working with, I was reading about him in the newspaper. And he talked about how great his life was, how happy he was. He had a new home, he had a new girlfriend, he had left his old family behind, he didn't need that anymore. And then when I was working with him, he was crying backstage because all he wanted was his wife and his kids back. He had just come out of rehab because of a drug addiction. And I began to see the discrepancy. I began to see what was conveyed to everyone else and the truth. And it really began to challenge me. I was living a life, a double life. There was what everyone saw and there was who I really was. And it scared me. I actually didn't know how to deal with it. And unfortunately, the only way I knew how to deal with it was by drinking, by partying, and even by dabbling in drugs. And although I never had an addiction, I definitely had a dependency on it because I didn't know how to deal with my issues and I didn't know where to go with it.
So when did your life begin to change?
I think I got to a point in my life where I began to realize all the things that I had weren't fulfilling me. And around my 21st birthday, there was a number of different experiences. But I suppose the biggest was that my mum invited me to a Catholic conference. It was happening in Glasgow, not far from where I lived. She basically told me she was going to Africa to do some mission work. She said, I'll be gone for 2 years. She said, but if you come to this retreat, I'll see you before I go. So, as I said, mums are very good at emotional blackmail. They can make you do things you don't want to do. And it felt like I didn't really have a choice. And I was sitting and I was thinking, should I? I don't really want to. And then she said, there's a priest coming that I think you know. And it was a priest we used to listen to when I was young. She used to put the CD on in the car. She would never talk to us directly about God, but she always had something to try and evangelize us. So when we were on family journeys, she'd put on some tapes or CDs. And I remember some stories that this priest used to tell. And I used to think he had a great sense of humor and he had a great way of explaining things. But he was the priest that had explained confession to me. So it had kind of gone right into my heart some way, in some sense. He had told the story of a young altar boy, and every week he had began to take some money from the collection plates when no one was looking. But this was back in the 50s and 60s when the priests knew how much money was coming in. So he had figured out what masses the money had been disappearing from and what altar boys had been on those masses, and he had been able to whittle it down to one guy, and he knew who had been stealing the money. And he got all the altar boys and he laid them out. And he said, I know who's been taking money, I know how much you've been taking, and he said, and I'm going to have to tell everyone tomorrow. And this young man thought, oh no, what do I do? And then he got a great idea. He said, confessions are on tonight. I'll go and tell the priest what I've done, and then he can't tell anyone. And this story helped me understand that the priest can't tell anyone what you've said in confession. Well, as it turns out, that priest wasn't on confessions that night. It was a visiting priest. So this young boy, but he was sorry. The next day when the priest brought everybody out, he basically said, I know who it was, and it's not going to happen again. He never made a big deal of it. And this young man was so impressed with the mercy of this priest that he decided he wanted to be a priest too. And he was the priest that told the story. And when he told me that, I thought, okay, God is merciful, people can be merciful. And it gave me a kind of hope for humanity. And I remembered that story when my mum invited me to this retreat. She said, this priest is coming along. You know that you enjoy his stories. Would you come for that? So I said, okay, I'll go.
You went on the retreat. What was your experience there?
And when I went to this retreat, I felt very uncomfortable because I was very aware of how separate I was from the way I know I should have been living. I felt unwanted. I felt separated. I felt like I wasn't part of what was going on. Yet as I looked in, I began to see the joy in the people that I met. And I began to be quite jealous of it. And in my heart, I began to say, why are they happy and I'm not? I've got money, I've got a girlfriend, I've got parties, I've got a nice big apartment, I've got lots of nice clothes, I've got popularity and fame and lots of jobs. So why am I miserable? And these people, they don't have any of these things and they're happy. And again, it was just this discrepancy between what I thought I wanted and what I really wanted. I began to become aware of it was like I felt like I was split down the middle. There was part of me craved this, but I didn't want to let go of what I had. And I realized I was just afraid. As the retreat continued, I heard the talks. The priests spoke, other priests spoke. They began to talk about the Eucharist in a way that I had never heard. They began to talk about the real presence of Jesus and how he offers himself so freely. They began to talk about confessions again, and they even began to offer confessions. I was like, oh no, I don't want to know this. Then they began to talk about how God wasn't far away up in the clouds, but he was very close and he loved each one of us. And I began to feel that love. I can't really describe it. It was just, but in my heart, I began to understand that I was loved personally. Not just all of us, but me personally. And I really didn't know what to do with that feeling. It just made me feel uncomfortable. But it provoked me to begin to pray. I began to speak to God in my heart, and I said, I know that you're here, but I don't really know what you want from me. And it was like suddenly I became aware of my conscience. I think I had blocked it out a long time ago, but it was this day I began to tune back in, God's voice speaking in my heart, which is what I think your conscience is. And I became aware that God was really saying to me, I love the real you, not the fake you. Because I was asking, why don't I feel loved? Why don't I understand? And I realized in my mind I had an image. It was like I was standing behind this wall, and I had built the wall so that people couldn't hurt me. And then there was a fake version of me that I had projected out into the world. And I was asking everyone to love this fake version of me. But God was looking over the wall saying, I want the real thing. And I was afraid. I was like, nobody likes me. Nobody wants me. I don't even love me. And that became a moment of awareness where I realized I wasn't letting God love me. So I just said to my heart, God, if you're really there and you really love me, I need you to show me in a way that I can understand.
So then what happened?
What happened next? I was so overwhelmed by the love that I felt. I actually began to cry uncontrollably, but not because I was sad, but because for the first time in my life, I understood my own worth, my dignity, and it all came from the fact that God loved me. And as I was in tears on the floor, I turned to my mum and I said, what's happening here? She said, I think God's trying to speak to you. I said, well, that's obvious. What's he trying to say? She said, well, you need to just talk to him. So I spent the next few moments, hours, I don't know, just conversing with God in my heart, realizing that my whole life, through all the hurts and the pains that I'd suffered, he had been there with me. But it was like I had built this wall and he was on the other side. And every time I tried to look, all I could see was the wall. And he almost spoke to me that day saying he wanted to remove the bricks. He wanted to take it away. So I decided I was going to go and make a confession. And I realized that each brick was the sins that I had put there, the misunderstandings, the lies that I had built up, the times that I pretended to be something that I wasn't. But I knew it was going to take time for him to dismantle it. But I knew that confession was the first real step. I wasn't ready to go that day particularly, but I took some time over the next few weeks to really examine my conscience, to talk to God, and I began to pray again. I went to confession in the cathedral in Glasgow, and I chose the confession in Glasgow because I knew there was a screen where the priest couldn't see me, and I was so ashamed of some of the things I had done. But I turned up on the day and I knelt down, and that day there was no screen. I was face to face with the priest. But I had already decided I'm going to do this. And I remember looking at the priest and saying, Father, I don't even know what to say. I don't know the words. I don't know how to make a confession. I haven't done it properly in years, and I don't think I've ever really been honest since my first confession. And he just smiled and he said, welcome back. And I just remember feeling this, again, this wave of love from the priest. But I knew I wasn't just talking to him, but I was talking to Jesus in him. And I thought, there's no point in hiding anything. Jesus already knows what I've done. So I began to tell him everything I could remember. All the times I'd hurt myself, the times I'd offended God, the other people I had hurt. And there were certain things I was really embarrassed about, but I thought, I'm going to do this. And I just prayed for the grace and the courage, and I said it all. And I expected for the priest to, be shocked, kind of, oh, I've never heard that before. But he didn't. He smiled and he looked at me and he said, well done. That was a great confession. I just felt this huge weight lifting off my shoulders. It was, I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't just spiritual, it was physically, I felt different. I felt a joy welling up inside me. As he gave me absolution, I literally felt like I was floating out of the confession. My friends began to notice. They said, well, what's different about you, Pat? Have you got a new girlfriend? Have you found a new drink or a new drug? I was like, I haven't. I found something even better. And I began to share my experience with other people.
All this sounds really nice. You converted, everything is going well, but
But I began to find that as I was moving into my faith, the people that I was sharing my life with didn't really want any part of it, because the way I was living was beginning to challenge them. I didn't need to speak words, and I didn't need to, convict them. God was doing it just through the changes that were happening in my life. I also knew there was a lot of things that needed to change. I was in a relationship, had been for years, which was very inappropriate. And I began to try to put boundaries in. And as soon as I did, it was like she wanted nothing to do with it. And I realized that I needed to give that up if I wanted God. I was still acting. And for the first time, I started being offering really big parts for big money. But every part I was being offered, I needed to compromise my faith in some way. I needed to do inappropriate scenes, or I needed to push an agenda that really I didn't want to. And I started refusing more and more work. And my agent got really angry. She said, if you don't start taking some jobs, you're not going to work here again. I got to a point in my life where I realized if I really want to live my faith, I'm going to have to give up everything. For me, it wasn't just a few little tweaks. I'd have to give up my career. I'd have to give up everything I had been trained for. I was giving up my relationships, my social life, everything that I knew. But what I had found offered me so much more than what that could, that it was a no-brainer. I was like, yes, of course, God, but you're going to have to provide for me. So I started looking to him to show me what to do. I just gave him the blank sheet and said, you tell me what you want. And that's when things really began to change.
You're talking about leaving a lot of things. Was it hard for you to say no to so many things?
It wasn't easy. There was a lot of attachment to these things that I had to kind of work through, and it didn't happen overnight. It was a slow progress, but I knew that if I really wanted to live my faith, it meant cutting myself off from these things. And even as I began to read scripture, Jesus said, if something makes you sin, cut it off. I was like, no, you can't get much clearer than that. So I said, God, if I walk away from this, I lose my friends, I lose my girlfriend, I lose my job, I lose my income. I was like, I even lose some of my family members who want nothing to do with this. I said, so you're going to have to provide these things for me. So I walked away from my job, and I remember praying that night. I was up all night worried because I had a family to take care of. My mum was still in Africa doing mission work. I had a sister who was still reliant on me. I said, I need work. The following morning, I woke up to a phone call, and it was a family friend who said, we've got a warehouse. We're really understaffed at the moment because it's coming up for Christmas. I said, could you come in just to help us out for a while? They said, we'll give you some money. I was like, yeah, no worries. I ended up working there for a year in this warehouse, but I worked alongside 3 great Catholic men who were very in their faith, who had lots of answers to the questions that I had, but also working with these great men who knew their faith, who had great families, who had raised their children in the faith. I was able to ask them questions every day. In fact, one of them got so fed up with me asking questions constantly, he bought me a catechism. He said, all the questions you have are answered in there, and he just gave it to me. So every break, every lunchtime, I just worked my way through the catechism. But one of the things at that time I found really difficult was I didn't have community. I didn't have people around me of my age who really believed. I didn't have support.
Pat, before we run out of time, you said that you were in a youth community. What was that like?
Craig Lodge is a community in Scotland where young people live together, and they run a retreat centre, and people travel from all over to go on the retreats, and the young people minister to them. But they have community together where they pray together, they work together, and they strive for holiness together. So every free moment that I had, weekends, holidays, I would travel and spend time with these young people. Even although it was hours on a train for me, it was worth the journey because I was being fed, I was being nurtured. So I ended up spending some time in community there. And I really prayed that God would reveal what he wanted from me. I said, God, you've taught me to speak in public. You've taught me to love music. You've taught me to share my faith with others. How can I utilize this for you, for your kingdom? And I just felt this real desire to go on mission. But I didn't know any other languages. I just knew that I couldn't do it in Scotland. And again, in my Bible, it said, a prophet's never accepted in their hometown. And I found that as I tried to minister to my family, my friends, it was like, we don't want to hear it. You know, we know who you are. I said, God, I know I want to go abroad. I want to go to a different country. But it's like, I don't know French, I don't know Spanish, I don't know German. I was like, how can I travel? But he fulfilled this desire that he put in my heart. And he brought me to Ireland.
How did Holy Family Mission come about?
5 years ago, Father Patrick and Maura came to me, approached me and said that they had an idea for a mission house. And as we talked, we realised that our visions kind of dovetailed. What we wanted for the young people is something that we all had different skill sets that we could share together. And we came up with the idea for Holy Family Mission. It kind of grew from there, and when we proposed it to Bishop Fonsie down in Waterford, he listened with an open ear, and he said, it really sounds like the Holy Spirit's doing something here. He said, what do you need to make it work? So we described what we needed. We said, we need a retreat centre, we need a house big enough for 20 young people, we need a big hall, we need lovely grounds, we need access to the cities to be able to evangelise. And he said, there's a place on my mind. He said, we'll pray. And he asked, how much money do you have? And I laughed and I said, I live in Providence. I said, I don't have any money except what God gives me. And he looked at Father Patrick and he said, I've taken a vow of poverty. And Maura said, I work for the diocese. He said, so none of you have any money, okay. And I said, don't worry, God has all the money in the world. He just keeps it in other people's pockets. So this was something we always lived by. He said, if he wants us to have it, he'll work it out. Well, Bishop Fonsie phoned us the following day and he said, that retreat centre that I was thinking about. We said, yeah. He said, the people who own it have just contacted me and they said they would like to gift it to the diocese. And we were in shock. He said, I told them if they'd called me a week ago, I would have had no use for it. He said, but the fact that it happened today, he said, this is definitely the Holy Spirit. So we moved in just about a month later. We started making plans for Holy Family Mission. That was in April. By the summer, we were putting together some plans. And in September, we started with 10 young people. And Holy Family Mission's been running for the past 5 years. Each year, the numbers have been growing steadily.
Pat, maybe before we run out of time, is there anything else that you'd like to say?
So our motto is to know God, to love God, and then to serve God. One of the first lines in the Catechism, this is what it is to be a Catholic, to be a Christian. If you know God, then you can love him. And if you love him, you want to serve him. And I realised for me, one of the biggest blocks I had is that I just didn't know him. I wanted to love him, but I didn't know who he was. And we want to offer that opportunity to young people. That's why we're involved in this mission, and please God, we will be for a long time to come, but we'd love to see that replicated and expanded throughout the world. And I'm very happily married now. We live here just not far from Holy Family Mission. We don't know what God's got planned for our future, but I look forward to it.
Pat, thank you for sharing your testimony with us today. I'm sure it will be a big help.
And thank you, Christina. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Know God, love God, serve God. How I loved hearing those words from Pat. Know God. Sometimes that's hard. Love God is much easier. And serve him, sacrifices. Like how Pat told us that he had to leave some things behind. But in the end, it's all so worth it. So let's leave everything and serve him. Thank you. Thanks for being with us.